Hey, what's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to do a very basic, quite simplistic, and rather rudimentary overview of the four basic eschatological end times views. All right. So in this video, we're simply going to look at a couple of charts together. I'm not necessarily going to be arguing between the positions as to which one is more or less faithful. In fact, one of the things I want to show you is that in all four of the basic end times views, there have been faithful, Bible-believing, evangelical, Christ-loving men of the Lord who have taught each one of these positions. Now, ultimately, of course, I have a position myself, though I'm still thinking through some of these things for my own sake. But I do think one of the positions is a little bit better than the others, and I'll let you know when it is that we get to it. But I did want to simply introduce these four views because sometimes, we refer to them as though we had a full comprehension of what they were, whereas it's kind of nice to set them side by side just to look at some of the details. Moreover, I'm actually preaching on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 tomorrow. Tomorrow is the Lord's Day, and I'm going to be referencing a couple of these overviews, arguing for one over against the other in my sermon tomorrow. And so I wanted to just kind of make this video for the sake of my own people, my own church, Gospel Fellowship PCA, and just to let them know that I have this video out there if they want to look more into these things. So again, welcome to this channel. My name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. So let's go ahead and have a look at the four major eschatological views. Now, don't be thrown off by the word eschatological or eschatology. That's simply a big word that means the study of the end times. Eschatos is the Greek word for last, and anything ology we know is a study of. Now, this first view here, this is the simplest of the four views, and this is the view that I would hold to myself. I do think that this is what we might call the standard Reformed view. And so for those who are Reformed or Presbyterian or Calvinistic in their theology, probably they hold either this view or the one that's immediately going to follow after this one called postmillennialism. But let's go ahead and just have a look at what this view is and why it holds what it holds. You're going to notice here that the title of this is called amillennialism. The word millennial or millennium means 1,000 years, and a is a negative, which means not. And so the name technically means not millennialism or not chiasm. Chiasm, again, is another word that means 1,000 years. Now, please don't think that this view denies the one passage in Scripture, Revelation 20, which speaks of Christ reigning for 1,000 years. This view does not deny any passage in the Scriptures. This is a faithful, Bible-believing understanding of eschatology. But what the A in amillennialism, perhaps it's even not perfectly named, maybe the name isn't exactly suited for what it teaches, because in amillennialism, there is, in fact, a millennium, and that millennium is now. It's the church age. It's the time from the time that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to the right hand of the Father until such a time as he comes again in glory. And so the position of amillennialism then holds that the millennium is a symbolic number. It doesn't exactly mean 1,000 years, but it's a very long time from the ascension of Christ all the way to the return of Christ. And so we don't deny that there's a millennium. We simply say that it is Christ ruling from heaven. And so the millennium, we would say in Revelation 20, pertains to Christ's current rule over all things. He is, in fact, at the right hand of the Father. So another thing we're going to look at in this view is that this view largely sees the entirety of the church age or the millennium as coextensive with tribulation. There will be tribulation throughout this entire time frame. This is a view that sees the church as largely a pilgrim church that is struggling along the way. It's faithful in evangelizing the world. It has a position of holding that the nations will be more or less evangelized before the return of the Lord, although not quite as optimistically as in the next view, postmillennialism, which we're going to see here in just a moment. Sometimes amillennialists will say that the Great Tribulation proper is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which I don't have here on this chart, but obviously would be down here to the bottom left at the very beginning of the church age, 30 or so years after the return of the ascension of Christ and the resurrection. So notice here in amillennialism, it's a very simple scheme, okay? It's a very simple overview. It's a very simple chart. And basically, amillennialism is waiting for one great eschatological event, which would be the return of Christ. We're waiting for Jesus to return. And notice here too that the return of Christ is the same thing as the rapture in this view. When Christ returns, he will catch the church up to himself. Of course, the word rapture is from the Latin Vulgate. The word rapture is not in any English translation, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe I'm wrong, but it comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, which speaks of Christ catching the people up to himself. And in the Latin, the old Latin, that's rapio, translated in the Greek word harpazo, to snatch up or to seize. And so this view sees the return of Christ as the same thing as the rapture. It doesn't deny the rapture, but it sees the return as the same thing. And this great eschatological event is coextensive or simultaneous with the resurrection of the dead. When he comes, he will raise the dead, and then Christ will judge the world. And then what we're waiting for after that is simply eternity, where we will spend eternity in either heaven or in hell, as the case may be, depending on whether or not we've been saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. So amillennialism is then the simplest view of the end times, but it does have some very great and significant adherents that taught this view throughout the ages. Now, sometimes people debate about which camp a certain writer may be in, because the terms that we're using today are somewhat modern innovations to understand these positions. And so, for instance, a guy like Augustine wouldn't come out and say, I am an amillennialist and not dispensational, because dispensationalism came way down the road. So that would be anachronistic to think about it in those terms. But nevertheless, broadly speaking, when we look at the writings of men like Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Bullinger, Herman Bavinck, more recently, Abraham Kuyper, Geerhardus Voss, Louis Berkhoff, Hendrickson, Michael Horton, these last few are alive today, Kim Riddlebarger and Sam Storms. These would all be men who have argued for more or less, and in the case of the latter theologians here, rather explicitly argued for the position of amillennialism. I tend to find myself largely in this camp. I'm drawn to the simplicity of it. I think some of the other schemes that we're going to look at are overly complicated, and perhaps they split hairs where hairs ought not to be split, and they make distinctions where distinctions ought not to be made. And so I find the amillennial view to be largely attractive because of its simplicity and because it sees the church as going through hardship in all ages. Of course, with 70 AD in focus as the center of Jesus' teaching in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, but yet nevertheless a church that struggles, albeit faithfully, to proclaim the gospel to the nations at the end of the day. Okay, so let's go on then to look at the second view. Now, this is another view that is held largely across Reformed camps. Reformed people tend to be post-millennial. And let's go ahead and look at the name here. The name means after the millennium. So whereas amillennials talked about the reign of Christ from heaven over his kingdom, which was on earth, post-millennialists are far more apt to think of the millennium as happening here in this world. And the return of Christ will be post-millennial or after the millennium. And in this view, Christ reigns from heaven now over the whole period, but especially with reference to a victorious and growing kingdom on earth. And this is what sets this view apart from the previous view, which we looked at as its optimism. Whereas amillennialism saw the church age as largely a great struggle to be faithful against much persecution in this world, postmillennialism is far more optimistic in that it sees the work of evangelism being largely successful. And so postmillennialists will often talk about a great, incredible even increase of peace and gospel success, such that the nations themselves are largely, if not entirely, Christianized, so that when Christ returns, he finds a very visible, very vibrant kingdom. Now, of course, this is not a utopian view. No postmillennialist would say that they're waiting for the utopia or something like that on earth. But the difference between this and the last is that postmillennialists are far more optimistic with the transformation of society, the transformation of culture, and even the nation states themselves being explicitly or at least primarily Christian in their worldview when Christ comes at the end of all things. And so we'll notice that the rest of this chart, aside from its notable optimism, is the same as amillennialism. There is a return of Christ, which is the same as the rapture. Christ will raise the dead at his coming. He will judge the world. And then once again, heaven and hell, depending on whether or not one is part of the elect, or to say it another way, those who've been saved by grace through faith in Christ. Okay, so that's post-millennialism. Now, again, there are a number of very notable adherents to post-millennialism. Eusebius and Origen in the ancient church, Martin Butzer, Theodore Beza, many of the Puritans, including Perkins, Matthew Henry was postmillennial, Thomas Goodwin, John Owen, Cotton Mather, John Eliot, Jonathan Edwards, my own favorite person to study, along with William Carey, Hodge, Warfield, Machen, Murray, Bonson more recently. These last few are more recent. Ligon Duncan and John Frame. Those would all be post-millennialists, okay? Let's go then to the next view, which we'll call classic premillennialism. Sometimes this view is simply called Kylism. So if you see, for instance, John Calvin arguing against the Kylists, this is the position that he is arguing against, as he does in his Institutes and his commentaries, okay? We call this classic premillennialism because it's much older than the final view we're going to look at here in just a moment. And notably, the reason why this is called premillennialism is because the return of Christ is going to be before an earthly millennium. Now, in this millennium, Christ is said to actually literally reign on earth, perhaps from Jerusalem itself. And this millennial state, this 1,000 years, this tends to take the term far more literally than the other two positions do. This will eventually give way to the resurrection of unbelievers. Notice that unbelievers here are raised at a different time from believers, which there's a hair that they split that I don't see as warranted to be split based on my reading of John 5, 28 and 29. But nevertheless, they put the resurrections in two different places. And then comes the judgment with eternity, heaven and hell coming at the end, as the other views do. Here in classic premillennialism or Kylism, notice now that we have a distinction between the rapture and the return of Christ, the rapture being the catching up of the church. But in this view, the return has to be a separate event, because if Christ is going to come down, in this view, he's going to then literally reign on the earth for 1,000 years before the judgment and eternity to follow. Like amillennialism, though, it largely sees the tribulation as the entirety, spanning the entirety of the church age, perhaps in some views with a great tribulation towards the end of all things. And also that's a possibility in amillennialism as well, the first view, that there might be another tribulation, which in some ways is like the 70 AD tribulation of which Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 24. Some would hold that that's a type of the greater tribulation that is to come. Others think of the tribulation as great, not in terms of its severity, but of its extent, its longevity. And so they see the tribulation as being the entirety of the church age. Okay, so that's Kylism or classic premillennialism. Now let's go finally to the last view. Oh, let's look at some adherents first. Justin Martyr and Irenaeus would be some earlier teachers of this view. But you have some real notables here, so don't totally ignore this one, because Spurgeon, as far as I understand, perhaps even Francis Schaeffer, Presbyterian theologian, George Ladd, and then John Piper, another current contemporary here, held this view. Finally, then let's go to dispensational, pre-tribulational, premillennialism. That's a mouthful, isn't it? This view is perhaps the most nuanced and far more complicated than any of the other views that we've looked at heretofore. And honestly, this is one of the reasons why I don't prefer it as my first choice. In fact, it's probably my fourth choice of the four views. Dispensationalism is a very complicated, overarching way to interpret the whole of the scriptures. But let's look at these two words here, pre-tribulational and pre-millennial. So in this case, the rapture is now a completely separated event from the return of Christ. These are seen as two totally different things, with 7 years of great tribulation in between. So in this view, the church age will suddenly be ended by what is a secret rapture. And here I'm going to have a bit of a counter argument for this in my sermon tomorrow. I don't think that the rapture could possibly be secret based on my reading of, for instance, the parousia of Christ, the return of Christ, which term literally indicates a great return of a conquering king or military victor to his city, in which there's great pomp and splendor and circumstance regarding his return. The words epiphania, meaning an intense manifestation, the word apocalypsis, meaning the revealing or the unveiling. I think all of those terms don't work well with a secret rapture view. Not only that, but in the rapture text of 1 Thessalonians 4:17, you also have the cry of command, you have the trumpet of God, and you have the voice of an archangel. None of those things would seem to be secret as far as I understand it. Now, this view tends to hold a rather literal 7-year tribulation period, and then the return of Christ then precedes the millennium, a literal 1,000 years of Christ reigning on earth. And again, that's why it'd be called pre-millennialism, because the return of Christ is before this millennial age. These folks in this camp do tend to hold to the literal number of 1,000 years. And sometimes, and again, I don't find this to be favorable, they would even say that during the millennium, Jesus would reign from Jerusalem, perhaps even reopening the temple for sacrifice again. I find that to be utterly uncompelling, that sacrifice would need to be necessary after Christ has become the final sacrifice for us on the cross. And then, of course, like the other views, it has the judgment of the world and then eternity in either heaven or hell forever. Okay, so as far as adherents of this view go, we do have some heavy hitters in this camp as well. John Nelson Darby is the originator for the most part of this view in the mid-1800s. And as far as I take these things, any theological novelty is not a commendation. And so the fact that the church for 2,000 years did not put things together this way, that would seem to argue against it being tenable in my understanding. Schofield, Schaeffer, Ryrie, D.L. Moody, there's a famous evangelist, Jim Elliot, Hal Lindsey, Jerry B. Jenkins, David Jeremiah, and I believe John MacArthur as well would fit into this camp, who otherwise I think is a wonderful Bible expositor. Okay, so I'm not denigrating any of these people or attacking their views necessarily. I'm simply arguing that if I had to choose myself, let me just roll it back here, I would probably find myself most closely aligned with amillennialism, or perhaps on days that I'm feeling more optimistic about the state of the world, a post-millennial view. But I'd love to hear your views in the comments. As long as you are kind and charitable to each other, please feel free to expand or elaborate what you believe. I'd love to hear from you all. Thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.